The girl tries to stand, the cold floor, trembling hands. "Please, give me back my crutch." Her voice almost fades, but the sound cuts through the air. The stepmother just smiles, feigning sweetness while everyone watches. And then, the door opens. A look changes everything. The millionaire father enters, and what he does, no one ever forgets. The late afternoon light streamed through the immense windows of Lena's room, painting the plush carpet with strokes of gold and orange. At 9 years old, she knew the world from shoulder height, a universe of tabletops, doorknobs, and the hurried glances of adults. Perched on the edge of her bed, she struggled to comb her long brown hair, a gesture that demanded a delicate balance. Beside her, like two faithful sentinels, rested her pink crutches, the rubber tips worn from constant use, but still vibrant. Every movement Lena made was a small symphony of effort and grace, a silent dance between will and limitation. Her immobilized leg, a constant reminder of a grey day she tried to forget, didn't stop her from dreaming, and the dream of that afternoon had a name: the big dinner party. It was the event of the week, where her father, a man whose fortune seemed to grow as relentlessly as the oaks in his garden, hosted friends and business partners. For Lena, it was a chance to belong, to be more than the quiet girl upstairs. With trembling fingers, she put on her best dress, a simple, light blue fabric her grandmother had given her. The final touch, a satin ribbon of the same color, was tied with difficulty to the handle of one crutch. It was her way of telling the world that even with her challenges, she could still be beautiful. She looked at herself in the mirror, a shy smile blooming on her lips. She so wanted her father to see her, to be proud. At that moment, the door opened without warning. Veronica, her stepmother, entered like a cold draft. She wore an emerald green dress that seemed to have been sewn onto her body, and her perfume of white lilies filled the room, overpowering the scent of childhood. Her eyes, an icy blue, scanned Lena's small figure, lingering on the blue ribbon with an almost imperceptible disdain. The mansion, under Veronica's command, was a stage for perfection. Every object had its place, every sound was measured, and anything off-script was seen as a threat. The girl, with her innocence and her clumsy crutches, was a constant error in that equation of appearances. The memory of her husband's first wife, Lena's mother, still haunted the halls, and the child was a living mirror of that sweetness Veronica worked so hard to erase. With a smile that didn't reach her eyes, she approached. "Darling," she said, her voice as smooth as poisoned velvet, "I think it's best if you rest tonight. These dinners are for adults." Lena lifted her face, her heart sinking a little, but she didn't let herself be defeated. "I promise I'll be quiet," she replied, her voice a thread of hope. "I just want to be with you all." Veronica sighed, a rehearsed sound of patience. "All right," she conceded. But her gaze hardened for a split second. "But you need to know how to behave." She turned to leave, pausing in the doorway. Her eyes returned to Lena, cold and calculating, and a shadow of intent crossed her perfect face, a silent promise that the night would be long and full of tests. Lena felt a shiver, but she clung to her hope, never imagining that her small battle for acceptance was about to begin. Descending the marble staircase was like descending a mountain. Each step was a victory, the soft tap of the crutch's rubber tips on the cold stone echoing through the silent hall. Lena moved with a concentration that belied her age, her body leaning forward, her arms steady. The light blue dress swayed with each step, a small spot of color and life amidst the austere grandeur of the mansion. The smell of beeswax and imported flowers intensified as she neared the dining room. From where muffled voices and the clinking of crystal could be heard, her heart beat an anxious melody against her ribs. She saw her father, Richard, standing near the fireplace. He was an imposing man whose presence seemed to fill any room. He was talking to two men in dark suits, gesturing with the hand that held a glass. They spoke of things Lena didn't understand, words like portfolios, mergers, and venture capital floating in the air like cigar smoke. For an instant, Richard's gaze met hers. He smiled, a quick, distracted nod, before turning back to his guests and his multi-million-dollar deals. That brief acknowledgement was enough to fuel the flame of hope in the girl's chest. She continued on her way, one step at a time, to the dining room door. The scene inside was breathtaking. A crystal chandelier poured golden light over the long mahogany table, set with the finest porcelain and silver cutlery that gleamed like stars. The guests, elegant and perfumed, laughed and conversed, their voices creating a tapestry of sophisticated sounds. Veronica was the center of this universe, gliding between guests with the grace of a ballerina, her smile fixed in place, ensuring every detail of her performance of perfection was flawless. Lena took a deep breath and took the first step into the room, then another. No one seemed to notice her arrival. The empty chair next to her father seemed to call to her. It was all she wanted, to sit there, to feel a part of that world, even in silence. When she was just a few feet from her goal, a shadow intercepted her. Veronica materialized in front of her, the smile still on her face, but her eyes as cold as chips of ice. "Darling," she said, her voice low enough for only Lena to hear, but with a public tone of care. "The main table is for those who can carry themselves properly." Lena's world stopped for a second. The words, sweet on the surface, were as sharp as broken glass. Veronica touched the girl's shoulder lightly, guiding her away from the gleam of the table. "You sit right here by the window, okay? You'll have a lovely view of the garden." The girl obeyed, the lump in her throat tightening until it hurt. She was left in a solitary armchair, far from the warmth of the conversations and the brilliance of the lights. From that distance, the party seemed like a silent film. She watched the faces, the laughter, the opulence, feeling like a ghost in her own home. The blue ribbon on her crutch, which had seemed so festive before, now seemed to mock her naivety. Veronica's promise, "You need to know how to behave," echoed in her mind, and Lena understood, with painful clarity, that it wasn't a condition. It was a sentence. From her armchair by the window, the world was a distant spectacle. Lena could see the room's reflection in the dark glass of the night, an overlap of lights and ghosts. The guests' laughter reached her like a warmthless echo. She watched her father, Richard, a giant at the center of his own universe. He spoke about his business, about the expansion of his assets and the profitability of his overseas investments. One of the men mentioned the fluctuation of the dollar, and Richard laughed, the confident sound of someone who had never had to worry about money. For him, the world was a chessboard where he moved pieces of capital and equity, always winning. Lena shrank into the armchair. She was invisible, a small blur on the periphery of this canvas of success and wealth. A waiter in white gloves hurried past, and the draft he created was enough to make the linen napkin, carefully folded on her lap, slip and fall to the floor. It landed just inches from her feet, but to Lena it might as well have been miles away. Reaching it without her crutches, which were propped against the armchair, would be a risky and humiliating maneuver. She looked around, searching for a friendly face. Her eyes met Veronica's, who was on the other side of the room, praising a painting on the wall. For a split second, the stepmother saw the girl's silent plea, saw the napkin on the floor. A flicker of understanding and of cruel satisfaction passed over her face before she turned to a guest, offering him another glass of champagne. The message was clear: you don't exist. Lena's heart withered a little more. The feeling of abandonment was a physical presence, cold and heavy. It was then that she saw Eleanor, the housekeeper, standing near the archway to the kitchen. Elena had been in the house since Lena was born. Her gentle hands were the ones that had often put her to sleep. Her brown eyes, always full of a sympathetic sadness, met Lena's and then settled on the fallen napkin. Elena understood the silent language of the girl's pain. She saw the rigidity in Lena's shoulders, the way she bit her lower lip to keep from crying. The housekeeper hesitated, torn between her loyalty to the woman who signed her paychecks and her love for the child she saw as a granddaughter. The conflict was visible on her face, in the hands that twisted in her starched apron. Finally, compassion won. Elena took a step forward, the intention to cross the room and help the girl written on her face. But before she could take the second step, Veronica, without even turning her head, raised her left hand in a discreet gesture, almost imperceptible to the guests, but a clear, sharp command to the housekeeper. A simple stop. Elena froze in place, her face paling. Veronica's power was absolute, an invisible web that controlled every movement in that house. Lena saw the gesture, saw Eleanor's hesitation turn into helpless resignation, and in that moment, the loneliness enveloped her completely, a dark cloak that separated her from everyone else. Time dragged on, each minute stretching into a cold eternity. Lena tried to distract herself by watching the patterns the chandelier light created on the polished hardwood floor. The hum of conversations was a sound barrier that isolated her even more. She could hear fragments of her father's voice, resonating with the authority of someone who commands an empire. He spoke about the importance of diversifying assets, about the profitability of certain hedge funds, and how his main company's cash flow was the envy of the market. An older man with grey hair mentioned something about cryptocurrency, and Richard smiled, patiently explaining the difference between a volatile asset like Bitcoin and the solid security of gold. His world was made of numbers, of graphs that rose and fell, of a net worth that expanded every second. Lena's world, at that moment, was the size of the armchair she sat in, and her greatest challenge was the white napkin that lay on the floor, unreachable. Suddenly, a discreet but insistent sound cut through the party's melody, the ringing of a cell phone. It was Richard's. He glanced at the screen, and his expression changed, becoming more serious, more focused. He excused himself from his guests with a nod. "It's a call from London," he explained briefly. "An important deal." As he passed Lena's armchair on his way to his study, he paused for an instant. His large hand rested gently on his daughter's head, an automatic, almost thoughtless gesture. "Everything okay, princess?" he asked, but his eyes were already distant, calculating interest rates and dividends, thinking in euros and dollars. Before she could answer, he had already moved on, his imposing figure disappearing down the hall. The brief moment of warmth dissipated as quickly as it had come, leaving an even greater emptiness. It was as if the sun had hidden behind a cloud. Her father's absence, even a distracted one, changed the room's dynamic. To Lena, it felt as if the temperature had dropped a few degrees. To Veronica, it was a signal. With Richard's departure, the only gaze that might question her had been removed from the equation. The stepmother finished her conversation with a charming smile and, with the excuse of checking on the waitstaff, began to move through the room. Her steps were silent, her movements fluid, like a shadow dancing among the lights. She didn't look directly at Lena, but every step brought her closer to the armchair by the window. She straightened a fork here, adjusted a glass there, a perfect disguise for her true intention. Finally, she reached Lena's corner. She leaned in, her lily perfume enveloping the girl like a cold mist. "Are you comfortable, dear?" she asked, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. Lena just nodded, her heart beginning to race. Veronica's gaze dropped to the pink crutches. With a movement that seemed casual, she reached out and took one of them. "This might be in the way," she said, her tone falsely solicitous. The girl held her breath, her fingers gripping the armchair's upholstery. The crutch, her companion, her extension, was lifted from the floor. "Let's see if you can behave without this," Veronica murmured, the sweetness in her voice turning into a poison only Lena could feel. And then, with the crutch in hand, she straightened up, smiling at a passing guest, leaving Lena off balance, half of her support stolen away. Lena's world tilted dangerously to one side. The loss of a crutch was like losing a limb, an essential part of her balance. Her body, accustomed to the dual support, trembled with the effort of staying upright in the armchair. Instinctively, she clung to the armrest, her knuckles white with tension. A cold panic began to rise up her spine. She looked at Veronica, who was now chatting animatedly with a woman wearing a pearl necklace, the pink crutch dangling from her hand like a bizarre fashion accessory. To anyone watching, the scene was innocent, the attentive hostess removing an obstacle from the path. But to Lena, it was a calculated act of cruelty, a display of power that left her completely vulnerable. "Please," she whispered, her voice so low it was barely audible, "give it back." The plea was lost in the buzz of conversations about the stock market and a new corporate acquisition. The stepmother, even if she had heard, gave no sign. She laughed at something the woman in pearl said, the sound crystalline and false as it echoed in the room. Lena felt her eyes well up with tears, but blinked them back fiercely, refusing to cry. Crying would be giving Veronica the victory she so desired. With a determination born of desperation, she tried to adjust, bracing the weight of her body against the cold wall behind the armchair. The effort made her muscles protest, but she managed to find a precarious point of balance. And then she smiled, a small, trembling smile, but a smile nonetheless. It was an act of defiance, a silent declaration that she would not be broken so easily. Lena's smile, however, was the trigger for the next phase of Veronica's plan. The stepmother excused herself from the guest, and T, with the same predatory grace, turned back to the girl. Her eyes scanned Lena's huddled figure, noting the fragile smile and the defiant posture. The cruelty in Veronica was a flame that fed on innocence. She couldn't stand to see the child's resilience, the echo of her mother's strength. "Oh dear, you're still here," Veronica said, feigning surprise. "Look at that. You left the other one behind." And in a theatrical gesture of someone just tidying up, she leaned down and took the second crutch, the one still propped against the armchair. "Let's put them both together so they don't trip anyone." The sound of the second crutch being taken from her side was like the closing of a prison door. Now, Lena was completely without support. The world spun, and she slipped a little in the chair, her body slumping lightly against the wall. Her trembling hands sought purchase on the smooth, cold surface, her fingers spreading out for any kind of grip. The girl's face was a mask of shame and pain. She was trapped, isolated on her velvet island, while the party continued around her, indifferent. Veronica, with both pink crutches in hand, looked down at her with a satisfied smile and whispered, her voice a thread of poisonous silk, "There now. Perfect." And with that, she walked away, hiding the crutches behind a heavy brocade curtain, completely erasing the child's identity and mobility. The polished hardwood floor had never seemed so cold and distant. Without her crutches, Lena was like a bird with clipped wings. The armchair, once a refuge, had now become a prison. Every laugh that echoed in the dining room sounded like a jeer. Every clink of silverware was a pang in her heart. She watched people move with an ease she had never known, going from the table to the fireplace, gesturing, living. They were like figures in a dream she wasn't part of. The smell of the food being served wafted through the room, a rich blend of herbs and roasted beef. But Lena's stomach churned. Hunger had been replaced by a knot of anguish. She looked at the plate of food a waiter, his eyes full of pity, had left on a low table beside her. The plate sat there, the food growing cold, so close and yet so out of reach. To get it, she would have to lean in a way that would surely make her lose her balance and fall. The humiliation would be public, the very scene Veronica was certainly hoping for. Lena's gaze swept the room for Elena. The housekeeper stood near the kitchen, her face a mask of conflict. Her eyes were fixed on Lena, and the girl could see the pain and helplessness in them. Elena knew what was happening. She saw the cruelty disguised as care, the silent abuse unfolding under the glow of the chandeliers. For a moment, the housekeeper seemed to gather her courage. She took a hesitant step forward, her body tense, ready to defy her mistress's silent order. But then Veronica's gaze found her. The stepmother didn't say a word, didn't make a gesture. She just stared at her from across the room, a cold, piercing look that was both a command and a threat. The message was unmistakable. Stay where you are. Elena retreated, defeated. She looked away, unable to face the disappointment in the little girl's eyes, and Lena understood she was completely alone. The classical music playing in the background seemed to intensify, each note accentuating the contrast between the evening's elegance and the sordidness of what was happening in that dark corner. The conversations continued, indifferent. Someone mentioned a famous family's inheritance. Another commented on the importance of having good liabilities to balance one's assets. They were words from an alien world, a universe where a child's dignity had no market value. Desperate, Lena decided to act. If she couldn't stand, she could at least try to feel less exposed. With immense effort, using her hands to push herself, she managed to slide from the armchair to the floor. The landing was soft, muffled by the Persian rug, but the cold of the wood seeped through the thin fabric of her dress. The world was now seen from a new, even lower perspective. The sound of expensive shoes passing near her, the scraping of chairs, everything seemed amplified. She dragged herself slowly, an inch at a time, toward the chair that had once been her goal. The floor was an ocean, and the chair a distant, safe harbor. The cry she had been holding back with such force finally escaped, a silent sob that shook her small body. And as the laughter and the sound of silverware continued, a little girl in a blue dress tried, on the cold floor of her own home, to reach a place at the table. The sound of cutlery and laughter was a distant white noise, a stark contrast to the cold of the floor seeping through Lena's dress. Every breath was an effort, every second a small eternity of shame. She curled up, trying to make herself as small as possible, wishing the Persian rug would swallow her whole. It was then that a different sound cut through the room's staged atmosphere. It wasn't loud, just a subtle shift in air pressure, the soft click of the study door opening. No one seemed to notice, except Lena. To her, it was like the first crack of a branch before a storm. Richard stood in the doorway, his imposing silhouette framed against the brighter light of the hall. His eyes, accustomed to the cold analysis of spreadsheets and reports on his vast assets, took a moment to process the domestic scene before him. He saw the glitter of crystal, the smiles of his guests, the regal posture of his wife. Everything seemed in order, a perfect picture of success and harmony, the kind of image that validated his fortune. But then his gaze lowered, sweeping the floor, and it froze. He saw the small patch of light blue near the window. He saw his daughter on the floor, her trembling hands braced on the cold wood, her face stained with silent tears. Richard's brain, trained to spot anomalies in complex balance sheets, began connecting the dots with dizzying speed, the empty armchair, the absence of the crutches. And then he saw it, partially hidden by the heavy brocade curtain, a familiar, unmistakable glint, pink. The satisfied smile on Veronica's face, which he had previously interpreted as that of a happy hostess, suddenly took on a new and hideous meaning. The atmosphere in the mansion changed temperature. The party's warmth evaporated, replaced by a dense, heavy chill. Richard took 2 slow steps into the room. There was no hurry in his movements, but each step was weighted with a terrible revelation. The tension spread like silent thunder, and conversations, one by one, died out, like candles blown out by an invisible wind. All eyes turned to him. "What is going on here?" His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm, sharp as a diamond. It cut across the room and silenced the last whisper. Veronica turned, the smile frozen on her face, trying to maintain her facade. "Darling, you're back," she said, her voice a little higher than usual. "Lena just had a little tumble, that's all. Children, you know." But Richard's eyes weren't on her. They were fixed on the pink gleam behind the curtain. He walked over to it, ignoring the confused stares of the guests, and pulled the crutches into the light. The pink plastic seemed to scream in the soft lighting. He held them in one hand, the irrefutable proof of the cruelty he had just witnessed. Then he turned and faced his wife. The distracted businessman had vanished. In his place was a father whose soul had just been torn open, in front of everyone. In an icy tone that made the entire room hold its breath, he said, "You took her crutches, but you're the one who just lost your footing." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy and crushing, broken only by the trembling breath of a little girl on the floor. Richard's words hung in the air, as heavy and irrefutable as a verdict. Time in the dining room seemed to stretch and shatter. The guests, once absorbed in talk of stock market volatility and the security of gold investments, were now frozen in their seats, forks suspended midway to their mouths, smiles petrified on their faces. Veronica's humiliation was a silent, devastating spectacle. The color drained from her face, leaving behind a waxy mask. Her lips parted, ready to weave a lie, an excuse, any thread of a narrative that might patch together her shattered image, but no sound came out. Control, her most precious asset, had been wrested from her. In the blink of an eye, she was no longer the perfect hostess, the queen of this mansion, but a pathetic figure, exposed in her cruelty. The empire of appearances she had so painstakingly built upon her husband's fortune crumbled in an instant. What was all this money, all this wealth, if the foundation of the house was made of sand? Richard didn't give her a second glance. He ignored the guests, the untouched food, the luxury that surrounded him. His entire universe had contracted to the small spot of blue light on the floor. He walked to Lena, and every step was a promise. He knelt before her, a giant bowing down. His eyes, which minutes earlier had shone with the coldness of a billionaire negotiator, were now flooded with a pain and regret so deep that Lena felt a lump form in her own throat. With a gentleness that contrasted with his large hands, he handed her the crutches. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice thick, a confession worth more than all his capital. "I didn't see. I'm so sorry." He helped her up, the touch of his hand firm and warm on her back. Lena leaned on him, feeling her father's strength for the first time, not as that of a powerful man, but as that of a safe harbor. He guided her, step by step, through the sea of shocked faces to the head of the table. He pulled out the imposing chair, the one always reserved for him, the seat of power. With infinite care, he sat her down in it. Then Richard turned to his guests, his face a contained storm. His voice, when he spoke, was no longer that of a host, but of a king reclaiming his throne. "In this house, love is in charge," he declared, his gaze sweeping over every person in the room, "and anyone who laughs at a child's pain will not eat at my table again." The effect was immediate. The embarrassment gave way to an uncomfortable haste. The dinner party was officially over. One by one, the guests rose, muttering flimsy excuses, avoiding the eyes of both Richard and Veronica. The conversations about business, dividends, and net worth died in the air. Within minutes, the room was nearly empty. Veronica remained standing, isolated, as the last guest hurried out, leaving behind the silence and the smell of a soured party. The front door closed with a final click, and the sound echoed in the immense room, sealing the end of an era. The next morning broke in silence. Not the tense, controlled silence of before, but a heavy silence, filled with the echoes of the previous night. In the dining room, the scene was of a party frozen in time. plates of expensive food, barely touched, crystal glasses with dregs of wine, crumpled linen napkins on the table. It was the scene of a shipwreck, the physical proof that the facade of perfection had shattered. Lena woke to the sunlight on her face and, for a moment, thought it had all been a nightmare. But then she saw her crutches, both of them, leaning beside her bed where her father had left them the night before. They were no longer hidden, no longer a problem. They were hers, and they were safe. The door opened softly, and Eleanor entered, carrying a tray. Her smile, for the first time in a long while, was genuine and reached her tired eyes. "Good morning, my angel," she said, her voice thick with relief. "Your father asked me to bring your breakfast up here." On the tray was everything Lena loved most. While she ate, she heard unusual sounds coming from downstairs, the sound of furniture being dragged. Richard was not in his study, on the phone, discussing his company's cash flow or the price of some cryptocurrency. He was in the main hall with two of the household staff. For the first time, he was looking at his own mansion, not with the eyes of an owner proud of his assets, but with the eyes of a father. He saw the thick, luxurious Persian rugs as treacherous traps. He saw the narrow corridors filled with vases and statues as obstacle courses. He had spent years accumulating a fortune, building a net worth in dollars and euros, but he had built a prison for his own daughter. "Take up this rug," he ordered, pointing to the immense rug that covered the hall. "And this one too. I want all the thick rugs removed. Today." The staff looked at him, surprised, but obeyed promptly. From her room upstairs, Veronica heard everything. Dressed impeccably, makeup on, hair styled, but with nowhere to go. She was a queen without a kingdom. She looked out the window and saw her husband, no longer the distracted businessman, but a man with a purpose that did not include her. Her power, which came not from money but from control and manipulation, had evaporated. Rage was a cold poison in her veins. She would not accept defeat. Later, Lena went downstairs and found her father supervising the removal of a heavy console table that blocked the path to the garden. He turned and smiled at her, a real smile that lit up his face. "We're making some changes, Princess," he said. "Making this house a real home." In that moment of connection, a shadow appeared in the doorway. It was Veronica. Her face was a mask of carefully rehearsed regret, her eyes glistening with tears that weren't real. She took a step forward, her hands clasped in a gesture of supplication. "Richard." Her voice was a trembling, calculated whisper. "My love, can we talk? I made a terrible mistake." Richard looked at Veronica, his face impassive. The woman before him was a stranger. The mask of sweetness and perfection had fallen away, and what remained was a talented actress playing the part of the penitent. He had spent years building a financial empire, dealing with the most cunning negotiators in the business world, learning to read between the lines of every contract and to spot falsehood in a handshake. Veronica's performance, to him, was transparent and insulting. He remained silent, letting her continue her act. He watched her walk toward him, her movements studied to convey fragility. "I don't know what came over me," she continued, her voice choked with emotion. "The stress of the dinner, the pressure. I just wanted everything to be perfect. I love Lena, Richard, you know that." The mention of his daughter's name was like an ignition switch. Richard's calm shattered, not in an explosion, but in a cutting coldness. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them, and the silent power he emanated made her instinctively recoil. He thought of all the capital he had spent to create this life of luxury, of all the assets she enjoyed, and he realized that the greatest liability in his life was not on his financial statements, but standing right in front of him. "Don't," he said, his voice low but resonating with absolute finality. "Don't use her name. Don't you dare." The silence that followed was dense. Veronica stared at him, the mask of regret beginning to crack, revealing the rage beneath. She had expected an argument, yelling, perhaps even a chance to turn the tables, to manipulate him with guilt. What she hadn't expected was this wall of ice, this serene and total rejection. "Regret doesn't erase something you did with pleasure," Richard said, each word a stone thrown against the fragile structure of her lie. He had seen the smile on her face the night before, the gleam of satisfaction in her eyes as his daughter suffered. That image was seared into his memory, indelible. He turned, giving her his back, a final gesture of dismissal. He was ending not just the conversation, but the entire empire of appearance she had ruled. True wealth, he now understood, wasn't measured in stocks or gold bars locked in a vault, but in dignity and love. He walked to Lena, who had been watching from a distance, her small heart pounding. He knelt in front of her, completely ignoring Veronica's presence, as if she were already a ghost. "I had an idea," he said, his voice soft again. "Remember how you told me you loved to draw? What would you think about turning my old study into an art studio just for you?" Lena's eyes widened. Her father's study was a sanctuary, a place of power, filled with phones, computers, and indecipherable charts. It was the heart of his business. The idea of turning it into a place of color and imagination was the most radical change of all. "Really?" she whispered, incredulous. "Really?" he confirmed, a new kind of return on that space. "The kind that makes you happy." Veronica watched the scene, her rage turning into a cold dread. He wasn't just rearranging the furniture, he was rearranging his life. And in this new arrangement, there was no longer room for her. The days that followed transformed the mansion. Richard's former study, once a bastion of male power, a nerve center from which he commanded his multi-million-dollar businesses, was methodically dismantled. Out went the dark mahogany bookshelves, the stock performance charts, the phones with direct lines to Zurich and Tokyo. Out went the business trophies, the net worth reports, and the books on investment strategy. In place of the immense and intimidating oak desk came lower tables, light wood easels, and boxes upon boxes of art supplies. The smell of old paper and leather was replaced by the sweet scent of fresh paint and wax crayons. Richard orchestrated the change with the same precision he used to manage his funds, but with a joy that money had never bought him. He had spent decades studying the market, turning capital into more capital, understanding the cash flow of entire nations, but the return on investment from a single smile from his daughter was infinitely greater. When it was all ready, he led Lena to the door. She hesitated on the threshold, her eyes wide, as if standing before a forbidden treasure. The sun streamed through the window, illuminating jars of paint in every color of the rainbow, stacks of white paper waiting to be brought to life, brushes of all sizes. It was a universe of possibilities. "It's all yours," Richard said, his voice gentle. Elena, standing beside him, had tears in her eyes. She watched the girl take the first step into her new kingdom, supported by her pink crutches. Lena touched a jar of yellow paint, then a blue pencil. She ran her fingers over the surface of a blank canvas. It was real. It was hers. For the first time, she was not an accessory in the house, not a problem to be hidden. She was the artist, the creator. Her first drawing was a big yellow sun, its rays stretching to the edges of the paper. Next, she drew a garden full of flowers, with vibrant colors that seemed to shout with joy. She painted, sang softly to herself, and the hope that once fit into a shy smile now filled the air of the mansion, spreading to every corner. Richard would spend hours there, sitting on a stool in the corner, just watching her. He saw the concentration on her face, the way the tip of her tongue would peek out of the corner of her mouth when she was struggling with a difficult line. In those moments, he wasn't a billionaire, he was just a father, witnessing his daughter blossom. The mansion, once cold and staged, was finally breathing. Lena's laughter echoed through the now uncluttered hallways. Elena hummed in the kitchen. Life was returning to the place. But from the shadows upstairs, Veronica watched. The sound of the girl's happiness was like ground glass in her ears. Every laugh was a confirmation of her defeat. She saw her husband and stepdaughter together, building a new world on the ruins of her own. Humiliation had curdled into a cold, patient hatred. She would not make a scene. She would not attempt another direct confrontation. The empire of appearance had fallen, but she still knew the art of invisible warfare. Standing in the gloom of her room, watching the scene of joy in the garden, a small smile formed on her lips. It was not a smile of happiness, but one of calculation. She still had one card to play, one last cruel trick hidden up her sleeve, and she would wait for the perfect moment to use it. A week passed, and the mansion felt like a different place. Where there was once an oppressive silence, now floated the soft sound of a pencil gliding over paper and, occasionally, Lena's pure laughter. The art studio had become the heart of the house, a place of light and creation. Richard found a new kind of wealth in that room, a profit that couldn't be measured on charts or deposited in a bank. It was the profitability of the soul. One afternoon, he entered the studio holding a rectangular object wrapped in velvet. Lena had her back to him, so focused on her drawing that she didn't hear him come in. He paused, watching her. The way she leaned over the table, the way her hands, once trembling with fear, now moved with purpose. It was the most valuable of all his investments. "I have a surprise for you," he said softly. She turned, her eyes shining with curiosity. He unwrapped the object. It was an elegant, light wood frame, and inside, protected by glass, was the first drawing Lena had made in the studio. The big yellow sun. The drawing was childish, the rays crooked, the color messily filling the outline. But to Richard, that piece was worth more than any master's painting his fortune could buy. It was the symbol of hope, reborn. "Let's put this somewhere special," he said. He led her to the main hall and, with a sense of ceremony, hung the picture on the main wall, in the exact spot where a formal, lifeless portrait of Veronica had once hung. Now, Lena's sun lit up the entrance to the house. From the top of the stairs, hidden in the shadows, Veronica watched it all. Every smile exchanged between father and daughter was a nail in her coffin of pride. The picture on the wall was not a tribute. It was a declaration of war, a trophy of her defeat. The cold, patient hatred finally found its plan. Later, while Richard and Lena were in the garden, she came downstairs. Her steps were as silent as a ghost's. She went to the studio and, with gloved fingers, picked up a single tube of paint. Black, she returned to the hall, her heart beating with a terrifying calm. She stood before the yellow sun. For an instant, she saw the reflection of her own face in the glass, distorted and grim. And then, with a quick, violent motion, she squeezed the paint and smeared it across the glass, a black scar tearing through the heart of the sun. She let the tube of paint fall to the floor, right below the frame, like a toy forgotten by a careless child. Minutes later, Richard and Lena came inside, laughing at a joke. Richard's laughter died in his throat. He stopped, his body stiffening, his eyes fixed on the black smear that desecrated his daughter's drawing. The joy vanished from his face, replaced by an icy disbelief. Lena followed his gaze. The air escaped her lungs in a small sob. Her son, her beautiful son, was wounded, bleeding darkness. "I didn't do it, Daddy," she whispered, her voice breaking, terror filling her eyes. "I swear, I didn't." Richard looked from the vandalized picture to his daughter's terrified face, and then he looked up. At the top of the stairs, Veronica stood, her hands clasped, her face a perfectly executed mask of sadness and concern, observing the drama she herself had created. The silence in the hall was thick, heavy with unspoken accusations and a cruelty that hung in the air like an invisible poison. Lena's eyes filled with tears. were fixed on her father's face, searching for a sign, a spark of trust. The fear of not being believed was a pain even sharper than the sight of her son stained black. Richard felt his daughter's heart tremble through the small sob she gave. He looked at the black smear, at the tube of paint strategically dropped on the floor, and then at the figure at the top of the stairs. Veronica's performance was masterful, the concern on her face, the posture of someone who had just discovered a disaster. Everything was calculated to plant the seed of doubt. But Richard was no longer the distracted man, absorbed in his business and his inherited responsibilities. His love for his daughter had awakened him. He saw the scene not as an accident, but as the final move of a desperate strategist. He knew that Lena's small hands, which were learning with such effort to hold a brush, would not have the strength or the malice to commit such an act. This was an act of adult hatred, disguised as a childish prank. Without a word, Richard walked to the staircase. His steps were slow, deliberate. Veronica watched him approach, a hint of triumph in her eyes. She believed he was coming to confront her, to start the argument she was prepared to win with her tears and denials. But he didn't stop to speak to her. He walked right past her, as if she were invisible, and continued up to her room. He went inside and seconds later returned carrying 2 designer suitcases, the same ones she had used on her luxurious trips through Europe. He walked down the stairs and placed the suitcases on the floor beside her. The gesture was final, unequivocal. "It's over, Veronica," he said, his voice devoid of anger, just a cold exhaustion. "Your time in this house is finished." Her mask finally shattered. Shock gave way to fury. "You can't be serious," she hissed. "You're going to believe her, a child over your own wife." Richard knelt beside Lena and with a handkerchief gently wiped the glass of the picture. The black smear vanished and the yellow sun shone once more. "I'm not believing her over you," he said, without looking at Veronica. "I'm choosing light over darkness, love over poison." He stood and looked at her, and for the first time, Veronica saw in his eyes not a husband she could manipulate, but a man she had lost forever. "The driver will take you wherever you want to go," he concluded. "My lawyers will be in touch." And with that, he took Lena's hand, turned his back on Veronica and the suitcases that represented all the material wealth she so valued, and walked toward the garden, leaving the empire of lies behind forever. Veronica stood alone in the hall, the silence of the mansion swallowing her whole. Lena's yellow sun, intact and brilliant, seemed to mock her from the wall. She had lost, she had been undone by her own vanity. Time, which had once dragged heavy as a chain, now flowed as lightly as the breeze that drifted through the mansion's open windows. The weeks following Veronica's departure were ones of quiet rediscovery. Richard, for the first time in years, delegated important meetings and ignored the fluctuations of the stock market. He discovered that the greatest dividend he could ever receive was the sound of his daughter's laughter, echoing through the now spacious and safe hallways. The house, stripped of its thick rugs and excessive furniture, seemed bigger, brighter. It could breathe. True wealth, he realized, wasn't in vaults or financial investments, but in the freedom to be happy within one's own walls. On a clear, starlit night, he prepared a new dinner. The long mahogany table, which had once served as a stage for humiliation, now felt intimate and welcoming, set for just 2. The flowers in the center weren't rare imported orchids, but simple daisies he and Lena had picked in the garden that afternoon. The candlelight was soft, warm. Lena sat in the head chair, not as a guest of honor, but as the queen of her home. She showed her father her latest drawing, a portrait of him, smiling, with the yellow sun shining over his shoulder. As they ate, they talked about simple things, the color of the sky, the taste of orange juice, a dream she'd had about a winged horse. There was no longer a need to behave, to measure words, to fear a disapproving glance. There was only peace, After dinner, while Richard was clearing the plates, Lena stood watching the moon through the window. She felt thirsty and looked at the water pitcher on the other side of the table. Her pink crutches were leaning against her chair, faithful as ever. She looked at them and then at the pitcher. A new determination shone in her eyes. With her heart beating a little faster, she steadied herself on the table with her hands. She pushed her body up, feeling her muscles protest, but she didn't give in. And then she let go of the table. For a second, she wavered, her body swaying like a sapling in the wind, but she held firm. One step, timid, uncertain, but a step, and then another. 3 trembling, victorious steps brought her to the water pitcher. Richard, standing in the kitchen doorway, watched it all, his heart overflowing with an emotion so overwhelming it stole his breath. It wasn't about walking, it was about flying. He returned to the table, his eyes shining. Lena, already seated again, smiled at him. A smile of pure accomplishment. He raised his glass of juice, the crystal clinking softly in his hand. She raised hers in return. "A toast," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "to what we've learned." He looked into his daughter's eyes, the mirror of his rediscovered soul, and said the words that sealed their journey. "Love is the only thing that doesn't need a crutch." She smiled, and the tear that trickled down her cheek was one of relief, of joy, of a whole future opening up before her. Outside, the wind moved the curtains where the crutches had once been hidden. Now, only the sound of laughter and a promise of happiness filled the house.